Thank you to our speakers this morning. I'd like to invite them up to the table here. We're running a little bit behind time, and I had brief remarks, and they're just gotten much briefer. So I will make very brief remarks. I have a few questions, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. I think we can indulge ourselves and go until 12:15 unless somebody else stops me. So first I wanted to say that the morning session focused on the historical context of the Belle-Étoile shipwreck, and the speakers took a different approach and concentrated on different aspects. Professor Averbuch, a Near Eastern specialist, provided a kind of macro view of regional trade centered on several high-value and ephemeral goods, camphor, cloves, and frankincense. Dr. Guy emphasized how pivotal the Belle-Étoile shipwreck has been in our understanding of international trade and cultural exchange in the early 9th century in the Indian Ocean. And Professor Hang focused on maritime trade and did a wonderful reconstruction of the Belle-Étoile shipwreck's travel and the potential timeline. So let's pause a bit here and think about what we did not know before the shipwreck was excavated. The scale of trading. If we think only of the Belle-Étoile shipwreck with over 60,000 pieces, it's simply mind-boggling. Commercial and export ceramic industry that's not related to tomb finds. So what can these objects from shipwreck tell us? They tell us different things. The network of Arab trading stations linked to an international system. Arab participation was also long distance, so it wasn't just island hopping, but it was also all the way from West Asia to China and Southeast Asia. Furthermore, the pivotal role of Southeast Asia in the Indian Ocean in a wider system of exchange, and how the 9th century marked the beginnings of a systematic trade of Chinese export ceramics to the West. And what do these papers all have in common, too? The role of economics, transfer of technology and designs and decorative motifs, and a new sense of how trade developed between West Asia with Arabs and Persians, Southeast Asia, and China, as we just heard, both island hopping and long haul. In addition, their wonderful methodologies, close looking at objects, reliance on archaeologically excavated material, and deep reading of textual sources. We saw that particularly in the last two papers. And one other point that Professor Averbuch brought up at the end, the openness to cross-traditional boundaries in academic inquiry. We have a Near Eastern specialist, a historian, an art historian, and I would like to say that that's one of the most important things that this Belle-Étoile shipwreck has done, is that no longer can we just look at China or just Southeast Asia or the Near East, the Middle East, Persia, the Arab lands. We need to talk in concert with each other. So I have a few questions, just a few specific questions. So for Professor Averbuch, were there other goods besides camphor? I know you mentioned some of them, but one thing that we haven't talked about all that much are textiles. It's possibly in the archaeological record the textiles don't survive, but perhaps you've come across some textual sources about that. For Professor Hang, what more, well, how does the reconstruction of the Belle-Étoile shipwreck and its path lead to further analysis about maritime trade in general? And is there more that we can learn about diplomatic missions? And for Dr. Guy, partly because you didn't have so much time to deal with this, would you elaborate a little bit further on the two additional shipwrecks and the Chowtan and the Panam Suri, and what they tell us about sort of 9th century, filling out the landscape or the seascape of 9th century trade? Two other questions for the floor or things to think about is what other kinds of goods, services, and people moved across these networks? And also this on the eve, it's not really the eve, the week before the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies opens in Berkeley. A couple weeks ago, I was at a Silk Road workshop, and one issue that came up was we're always talking about overland transport, exchanges over land, and never mind whether we use the term Silk Road or not, that's a freighted concept. But I was struck by how important it is for the overland researchers to talk to the people who deal with maritime routes. And so the question is for anyone, especially our scholars here, is what kind of research or research projects would you encourage for this kind of collaboration? So I would like to ask the speakers if you'd like to respond to those questions, and then we'll take questions from the floor.
Okay, so about the question of textiles, it's extremely important. And John Guy has written a whole book, Woven Cargoes, about this, which is a great book, lavishly illustrated, and it talks at length about this. But for the period that we're talking about, the evidence is very scarce. And as mentioned, textiles don't survive well in tropical climates. What we do have are textiles which survive in archaeological sites in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. So we get fragments there. And so we know that fairly significant quantities, you discuss it in your book, are circulating in those areas. And these are textiles, cotton textiles from India. Of course, Near Eastern lands and the Islamic geographies give us a lot on this, produce lots of textiles themselves. So later periods, looking at later periods strongly suggest, and again, I would recommend looking at the book for details. And Kenneth Hall talks about this too in his history of early Southeast Asia. The textiles, I believe, were being traded alongside fairly large quantities, as I mentioned, of glassware. So Muslim traders in ports in places like Java, Sumatra, southern Philippines and Brunei, quite likely, would have been exchanging wares like these. And these did not always stay in the ports. What happened was these kinds of goods made their way to upland, jungle, and mountain regions where the people who gathered the goods were. In the case of the Spice Islands, like the Clove Islands and Nutmeg Islands, what very likely happened was that some of these textiles, along with things like Javanese rice, made their way out there and then were exchanged for these spices. But we have very little evidence in this period. And as a couple of authors noted, we typically on maps from this era, we see the trail end at the Spice Islands, but it probably wasn't the end. Those commodities were probably traded further east, all the way to places like New Guinea, in order to provide things like sago to the islands and other foodstuffs, because these islands are very small. So that's a brief answer, but we're only just beginning to come to grips with it, and I can give you, or John Guy could give you more bibliography.
Shall I just continue that line just for one moment, Derek? Just on the to briefly characterize the whole textile trade as it relates to the Indian Ocean, it's essentially a cloth for spice trade. The primary motivation in exporting large quantities of textiles from the Indian subcontinent east. We think always of the Chin's trade west, but the history goes back well into the first millennium. The archaeologically dated radiocarbon-14 dated textiles from Fostat and a number of the ports along the Red Sea, Persian Gulf area to the 8th, 9th, 10th century, and there's even earlier material to the late Roman ports of the Red Sea. So these are well documented and coexist with other Indian imports from subcontinental India to the West Asian trading ports. When the Europeans intervene into the trading picture in the 16th century onwards, the Portuguese and then the Dutch and so on, what they quickly discover is that there's a well-established pattern of trade which goes back undoubtedly to this early period, in which cloth is the primary commodity for barter trade, non-monetarized exchange in which textiles are used to secure the spices essentially of the Moluccas. This tiny little cluster of islands close to New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, extraordinary concentration of spices, which we know traveled all the way to the Mediterranean, even into England in the 8th century. They're recorded in the property of We have Indonesian spices, cloves appearing and in early inventories of people's estates from that time. So the textile trade is a key factor in this. Yeah.
So let me address the question about reconstructing, the Belitung Wreck, and how does that sort of work in terms of the reconstruction of trading networks and the way trade occurred across sort of maritime Asia, in this period of history, and obviously into sort of the early modern era. We have to recognize that when we look at the Chinese textual corpus and some of the other corpus as well, they do fill holes. The one corpus might have gaps that another corpus will be able to fill, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, if we even just think about ceramics as trade items, for example, from about the 10th to the 14th century, there's so much ceramics were exported out of China into Southeast Asia and the rest of the Indian Ocean. And yet we really only have about 4 or 5 sort of specific textual mentions in the whole corpus of the Song and the Yuan period that speak specifically to the nature of the export of ceramics from China into the rest of the world. And so when you have that kind of a situation, you realize that if you just concentrate on one aspect of the sources, you get blindsided in many, many ways. And so the way to think about it, obviously, is that the Belitung really just reflects one aspect of it in a very specific point in time. If you do the exact same kind of exercise across sort of like 8 or 9 or 10 different wrecks over about a 400-year period, then what you then get is not a still image that's locked into a specific point in time, but you get, sort of like a moving image that provides a sort of a moving narrative. And then you can actually see the evolution of the nature of the trade in its different facets, as it were, over, like a 400 or 500-year period. And one of the things about that, obviously, is that you then get a good sense of how the trade sort of develops and what it feels like, in a sort of very broad macro perspective. And that really is sort of what we want to get at. Part of the problem, obviously, is that the corpus tends to be, especially for Southeast Asia, it's very reliant on the Chinese textual material. And that's part of the reason why your paper is wonderful, because it just provides that other perspective from sort of the West Indian Ocean tradition, but speaking very specifically, as it were, to this area of maritime Asia, which I think is a really wonderful sort of breath of fresh air.
And vice versa for yours.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so Doris asked me to speak a little bit more about the Phnom Surin shipwreck from the Gulf of Thailand. It is a remarkable discovery. It's a vessel of similar scale and same ship architecture as the Belitung. The estimated length is around 35 meters. This is a big boat. 2-master. Each mast is around 17.5 meters in length. This is a large-scale vessel. It had done its business, unfortunately. There's essentially no cargo in the vessel itself. It had obviously been doing its trading with the interior of lower central Thailand and had perhaps begun to source other materials. At the elephant tusk, the deer horn, these are commodities we know were in demand in East Asia. The VOC built a whole business around horn and deer skin to trade with Japan in the 17th century. So these are important antecedents for this. The mix of cargo was fascinating because it has this early Guangdong material, but no changsha or any other, or the whitewares that we would associate with the 9th century trade of represented by the Belitung. I think you can draw a line in the sand in terms of the moment when you have industrial scale commercial production of ceramics in China for export, principally changsha, but also including the whitewares and the Guangxian wares as well. And it seems to be in the first quarter of the 9th century. I place the Thai wreck probably towards the end of the 8th century, and the profile of material really parallels other discoveries that have been found on land sites for excavations happening at the moment on the islands of Zanzibar, East Coast Africa, where torpedo jars, early Guangdong ceramic material has been found, and other associated Islamic items, including coinage, which is dated, Abbasid coinage, no Changsha material. It doesn't appear in these earlier sites. It pops on our radar really the beginning of the 9th century, as far as we can tell at this point. The exciting moment, of course, when I went to see this wreck 18 months ago, which is now located about 8 kilometers in from the coastline of the Gulf of Thailand, in what essentially is reclaimed mangrove land. It's drained and used for prawn farm production. That's how the site was discovered. That's undoubtedly due to coastal expansion over the last 1,100 years. The wreck has been absorbed into that. But the presence of these torpedo jars is a very important marker for us. We've not seen these before. They've never been reported in Southeast Asia from illicit excavation or controlled excavation. It's the very first time. They're well known from the Gulf, they're well known from East African trade, so that's a very important new appearance. And then to have the good fortune for one of the torpedo jars to have this chiseled inscription. It's been cut into the fired clay after production. It wasn't incised into the wet body of the clay like most of the Guangdong jars with their pseudo-Arabic inscriptions, which are made at the moment of production. It's been chiseled in later, and we had the very good fortune to have it translated by Professor Okta.
Professor Chervaux. Professor Chervaux at Harvard.
Starts off at Harvard, and it reads as a proper name. So we have clear identification. So as with the Belatung, in many ways, much of what it tells us is not a complete revelation. We, in a sense, it was hinted at, it was alluded to in the written sources already. The Arab geographies, the Chinese dynastic histories, and so on provide much of this information. But we've never before had the archaeological evidence as an affirmation of that. And so this is a very important closing of the circle in terms of our knowledge and our ability to trust the written sources. Now we've got, the cargo as exhibited at Asia Society is just the most tangible evidence you could hope for. The fact that we've now got our first torpedo jar complete with its Pahlavi inscription. We know the Pahlavi, which exists as a late Sasanian language, Middle Iranian, has an afterlife. Beyond the Sasanian period. It's there, we get it in South India in the 840s. There's a contract, a copperplate charter produced in early 9th century, written in Tamil, confirming trading privileges for foreign merchants in South India. This is Kerala, and we're talking the home of black pepper, of course. This is black pepper originates is principally supplied globally from southwest India. The 3 signatories to the copperplate inscription had their names engraved in Arabic, in Judeo-Persian, and Pahlavi. These representing the 3 foreign trading communities active in South India, early 9th century. This again fits perfectly with the broader picture we have of this new shipwreck evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions. Tan-san, and please identify yourself and wait for the mic. We have traveling mics.
Tan-san, City University of New York. Perhaps a little bit of naive concerns about the presentations and a question to Brian. I think the use of the words Tang and Malay and Arab displaces the agency of private traders who perhaps do not care for these categories that we are mentioning today. I think there were lots of private traders who were mixed up different categories. I think it's better not to assign Arab just because the ship may have been Arab. It could have been owned by a Shivajian person, right? So that's one concern. The second concern is mixing up the 9th century with the later Sung or the earlier mid-8th century Tang is problematic. I think the 9th century by itself is a unique period and lots of things are happening during that time, and we should not compare it to what's happening during the Sung period. A third concern is total lack of use of Buddhist sources. I think there are the people who actually travel on the seas where the Buddhist monks, I Ching, for example, and Tianzhen, who goes to Japan, talks about various issues in Guangzhou. I think that kind of sources are important to see about what the eyewitness accounts are saying, including the tomb inscription that was found about the Tang eunuch who went to the Arab Caliphate. So I think the sources are still limited to the earlier ones. The question to Brian is, if you look at Abu Zaid al-Sirafi, he uses the word China ships when he's talking about ships going from West Asia to India, but he does not use that term from India to Southeast Asia to China. Is he talking about different kinds of ships?
So thank you very much. If I may answer that, to that last part. The consensus that I've read, but there are people who don't agree with it, is that when he refers to Chinese ships, as-sufun as-siniya, the way that that needs to be read is China ships in the sense of a China clipper from a much later period, or an East Indiaman. These are ships that are plying the waters towards those areas. The other thing that it's probably worth keeping in mind is that Abu Zaid as-Sirafi, he views this vast region as a continuum, and his terms can be a little vague. He refers to the whole space as the Sea of India and China, which I like because it sounds like the Indo-Pacific. But he is, of course, writing this not only to inform but to entertain, and it is not always possible to read it for too much precision. He gives important clues, but I think this is probably right, that what he means are China ships, but he tells us himself that these ships only go normally in the 10th century as far as the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. We have other stories that show merchants going beyond that all the way to China. And I think this is important because, of course, conditions are different, and that is why it's problematic at times to treat the 9th and 10th centuries as a continuum. And they're not, of course, not for the merchants in the Middle East, because events in China and Southeast Asia affect them, and not, of course, from the point of view of people on the other end. So the mention of the China ships, as far as I know, that's in 851 or thereabouts from Suleiman the merchant, when they are making the direct voyage. I would have to go, and I will go after this, to see if Abu Zaid repeats this term. To clarify, he put all these texts together around 916. So I'll go and have a look and see if he repeats that term outside of the reports that are supposed to be from the mid-9th. Thanks.
Go ahead.
I have Shirley Muller, Indianapolis. I have 3 easy questions compared to the last question.
Very easy, because you're really only supposed to have one, but go ahead.
Okay, well, Dr. Guy, did you mention what the torpedo vessels are used for? Dr. Hink, could you put the 400 years of transglobal shipwrecks into perspective? You mentioned it, but I'm not sure I heard the perspective. And Dr. Averbuk, could you talk about camphor being used for medicinal purposes in the Tang Dynasty? Is there a record of that? Thank you.
Torpedo jars first. We have late Roman sources that talk about amphora, which these are direct descendants of the amphora, and they're specifically listed as containers for wine and for oils. It's pretty, the examples in Thailand have not yet been tested, but they've done almost identical examples which have been recovered at major monastic sites in Sri Lanka, urban centers which had commercial importance as well, like Anuradhapura and some other sites on the southern coast of Sri Lanka, where substantial quantities of torpedo jars have been recovered. These have been taken for analysis and confirmed that they're lined to make them so they're no longer porous with bitumen sourced in Iran. They're very specific about the science has been done, and the origins of the bitumen has been identified as Iranian, which of course fits perfectly with the place of manufacture of the jars. So they were sealed on the inside in order to be waterproof, as it were, and traded widely. I won't go on. That's yeah.
Okay. So I can answer your question about, the sort of 4th century sweep, along with Hanson's comment about the need to distinguish between like the Tang and the Song period, for example. What we do see is from the 9th century onwards, and it's a trajectory that does not stop. It begins with sort of large-scale economic output in terms of manufactured products from China in exchange for all sorts of products from the maritime Asian realm, including natural products from Southeast Asia, textiles, so on and so forth, glass and all that from the Middle East. And it does not stop. That trajectory of economic relationship continues with a increasing what we call vertical economic integration between the economy of China, for example, and Southeast Asia, so much so that primary production occurs in terms of product production in Southeast Asia, and China is providing the sort of secondary sort of, industrial output, right? And you actually get a whole economic sphere developing in East Asia over the next sort of 400 to 500 years. By the time you get to the 14th century, Southeast Asia is exporting large quantities of things like construction timber and all that to China for the production of, furniture up in China, while sort of, ceramics, textiles, and all sorts of things, including metalware, coming down from China into Southeast Asia and obviously into certain parts of the Indian Ocean as well. If you take that as the long trajectory, then what we have is a historical dilemma. The textual material in China tends to provide that delineation between the Tang period and the Song period. But if you look at this whole sort of economic development from outside of China and the Chinese textual corpus and its chronology, then you are in some ways obligated to look at it as a single trajectory, as it were, over a significant period of time, or maybe say half a millennium. And so when you look at that, in some ways, it's a continuity for those trading partners of China as they're dealing with the dynastic changes, for example, and the vacillations of China politically, within the Chinese sort of landmass. From the Chinese perspective, there are obviously clear differentiations. The change of dynastic houses, the policies that are there, that are enacted over time, have ripple effects, obviously, into the external economy. And so you are able to sort of put, chronological, demarcation points. And I think the two needs to be looked at together, because the external trading partners are reacting and then proactively sort of, adjusting to these changes in China. And in China, there are policies that are occurring and, new policies that are put in place that have an impact on international trade. So in a sense, it's not so, it's not so binary, as it were. And it's you kind of need to look at it over sort of a 500-year sweep.
So very briefly, this question about camphor. The short version is yes. Donkin wrote a whole book about this, Dragon's Brain Perfume, an historical geography of camphor. And he deals with it for Islamic lands, China, India, Europe. Schaefer worked on it as well. I just wanted to mention something going off of this idea as a continuum, and I probably should have mentioned it in the earlier question when we were talking about differences over centuries. If there's one structural continuity that I see, and seeing it from the perspective of a historian of the spice trade, it's the continued demand for these commodities. Elites needed them, or thought they needed them, and they were going to have them, whatever structural adjustments in trading networks needed to be made. So I think if you look at sources like Donkin and others, what really emerges is the fact that people had to have these substances and were willing to pay nearly any amount of money to get hold of it. It was an issue really of prestige. But in the case of medicine that you mention, what's important and what we can't lose sight of is that elites anyway of the era and physicians of the era believed that these things were life-saving and life-enhancing commodities. So the price of spice and aromatics for these people was the price of life from their point of view. Camphor in the Near East was thought to bring down fevers. for example. Cloves were thought to have the ability to stop hemorrhaging. So looking at that kind of a question, if we want to ask why was there such a need for these things, we should look at topics like that.
It would be lovely to continue our discussion now, but we are out of time. Let me remind you that we have a reception at the conclusion today, so if you have any questions, please hang on to them for that, and we can continue that discussion. The afternoon session will begin promptly at 1:30, and please join me again in thanking our speakers.
That was great.